In the landscape of modern fantasy tabletop settings, ambiguity has become the default. Many settings lean into the idea that morality is subjective, and that good and evil are merely shades of gray determined by perspective. This is reinforced by pantheons that seem to follow the good and evil alignments, but in play are completely abandoned by the dungeon masters, always having the good but actually evil twist, like a holy order that commits atrocities against civilians for the greater good. But when we abandon the notion of true good and true evil, we do not create complexity. We create vacancy. A world without moral structure lacks stakes, direction, and ultimately meaning. In contrast, a world where good and evil are tangible forces, not abstract philosophies, but fundamental truths, creates a foundation upon which richer, more profound narratives can be built. I say all of this because moving forward, this is the framework that I am using. You yourself might enjoy moral ambiguity or gray morality, and I believe even if you do, you'll get something out of this video, but to me, the mythic weight of moral absolutes is incredibly important and necessary for fantasy tabletop role-playing games, especially those that include classes like the Paladin. With that out of the way, Paladins in fantasy settings are often reduced to caricatures, self-righteous knights in shining armor, or even worse, rule followers enforcing an arbitrary code. But if we embrace a world where true evil exists, not as a vague, relativistic concept, but as a real force, then the role of the Paladin becomes something far more interesting. They are the vanguard of good, the sword and shield of divine order, and the bulwark against corruption. To truly understand Paladins, we must separate them from the modern tendency towards moral ambiguity. The world they inhabit is not one where evil is just a perspective or where every villain is a victim of circumstance. It is a world where evil is an active, tangible force, where demons seek to twist and corrupt, dark gods demand human sacrifice, and tyrants revel in domination for its own sake. Evil is not just something that exists in opposition to the Paladin, it is a thing that grows when left unchecked. And so the Paladin does not merely fight evil, they conquer it. The thing you need to understand is that a Paladin is much more than a fighter with a divine power set. They are the moral engine of your campaign setting under these parameters. As characters, they must wrestle with duty, faith, and the consequences of their actions. Unlike mere soldiers or mercenaries, a paladin carries the weight of a higher calling by default. You as the dungeon master don't have to work any sort of narrative into it. Simply by virtue of being a paladin, they already carry that weight. They do not kill for personal glory, wealth, or even revenge. They execute justice. But justice itself is not always clean. There are times when the paladin must make the hard choice. Not between good and evil, mind you, but between competing virtues. This is one of the main advantages to a morally absolute world. Instead of continuously muddying the waters of morality with gray options and relativism, when it comes to your divinely powered warriors, you can instead offer truly complex scenarios. Instead of asking of them, what is the lesser evil, you should instead ask, what is the greater good? Embrace the mythic archetype of the paladin. They are more than just warriors. They are symbols. Their mere presence is a beacon, a declaration that evil will not go unchallenged. But with that status comes expectations, scrutiny, and the burden of perfection. As a player, what are you doing to ensure that your depiction of a paladin stands up to this type of scrutiny? How does a mortal gifted with divine power live up to an ideal? That, I think, is the greatest detail of a paladin. That despite having this divine power, this connection with a higher being of good, a paladin themselves is not a god. They have doubts, they feel fear, and they make mistakes. Yet despite all of this, they persist. Not because they are flawless, but because they refuse to succumb. That is ultimately what makes them the most compelling. Not their invulnerability, but their unyielding will in the face of corruption. One thing that I think a lot of people get wrong is that they depict paladins as a sort of balance keeper, like those looking to maintain the order of things. This might work for some settings, but in a world of moral absolutes, paladins are not about balance. They do not seek to understand evil or negotiate with it. They eradicate it. They are not the champions of compromise, but of conviction. This is why they stand apart from other warriors, clerics, or even priests. They do not simply wield a sword, they are the sword. If you embrace this vision of a paladin and your setting, you instantly transform paladins from some mechanical smite bot into something far richer. A figure that does not just fight, but inspires, who leads not by force alone, but by the power of their presence. Those who carry the weight of righteousness even when it breaks them. This is mirrored in the Holy and Divine Orders. They're not merely a collection of knights sworn to a cause or a guild of clergymen governing rites and rituals. A true holy order is a bridge between the divine and the mortal, a martial and spiritual institution that exists not for its own perpetuation, but in service to something higher than itself. It is a statement about the nature of good and evil in your setting, an institution that embodies conviction, struggle, and the eternal fight for righteousness. Its members are not simply warriors or clerics. They are instruments of a divine will, bound by purpose, tested by hardship, and forever caught in the battle between light and darkness. There are a few ways that you should think about these two things and how they relate to your setting or game. The fantasy that a paladin fulfills is a heroic archetype beyond mortal struggles. They embody a fantasy that is older than the games in which they appear. The knight-errant, the divine champion, or the chosen warrior who stands for something pure and unyielding. In many settings, the world is shaped by powers beyond mortal comprehension. You've got gods, fiends, cosmic forces of chaos and order. Paladins serve as the mortal vanguard in this great struggle, through their holy orders, bridging the gap between humanity and the divine. Paladins give players the opportunity to step in the role of an active force of justice and righteousness. Unlike most classes or character archetypes that largely react to events, paladins must initiate them. They are not like other adventurers chasing wealth or power. They are champions pursuing a cause regardless of the personal cost. And for the creators out there, the presence of paladins in a setting does more than just create a powerful character option. It should establish the moral structures of your world. Paladins, and even anti-paladins if you include them, should not exist in moral ambiguity. They cannot serve both light and darkness, nor bend their principles for convenience. Their very existence affirms that some sort of good and evil exists within the setting as real and absolute forces. If a paladin is granted divine power, then that power has a source. Now, whether that is a god or a cosmic principle or even the very fabric of righteousness itself is completely up to you. But if they wield good and holy might, then evil must be something tangible enough to be smitten? I don't know the right word. But if they take an oath, then that oath must be more than just words. It must have meaning, consequences, and an eternal struggle that fuels it. This is one of the reasons paladins are the most compelling characters in fantasy settings in the first place, because they cannot just walk away from what they've sworn to do. A rogue can break their code, a fighter can abandon their cause, and a wizard can choose a different study path. But for a paladin, to break their oath is to lose themselves. One last thing. There are few tropes as overplayed, uninspired, and creatively bankrupt in tabletop role-playing games as the holy order that's actually just evil. You know the one. The revered paladins of the Radiant Sun or whatever are secretly a brutal inquisition. The noble church of the goodly god is actually just a front for corruption, and the guardians of virtue sacrifice orphans. This is a trope that, rather than adding depth, often undermines the setting, cheapens the themes of morality, and betrays a lack of understanding about the role of faith, righteousness, and holy orders in fantasy in the first place. Subversion works best when it surprises the audience or players, when it forces them to reconsider their assumptions. But let's be honest, the Holy Order is actually evil hasn't been a surprise for a long time. The moment a campaign introduces a powerful and respected church, half the table will already be rolling their eyes, waiting for the shocking reveal that the clergy are, in fact, the real villains. It's been done to death in video games, fantasy novels, anime, movies, and tabletop campaigns. When a trope is this predictable, it loses any ability to engage the players emotionally. It's not a bold narrative choice, it's a tired, hollow imitation of actual storytelling. And if everyone sees the twist coming from a mile away, what's the point? It's also just a cheap shot at complex morality. What makes holy orders interesting in a fantasy setting is that they represent something bigger than individual failings. They embody ideals. Their role is to be a moral institution or a guiding force that shapes the beliefs of the people and the world around them. That doesn't mean they should be perfect, but making them secretly evil reduces the entire concept to an empty husk. True complexity doesn't come from they were the bad guys all along. It comes from actually exploring the nuances of faith, duty, and righteousness. What does it cost to uphold justice? How does faith endure through suffering? What happens when good people make mistakes, not because they're evil, but because the path of righteousness is hard? Corruption within an institution can be compelling. A misguided leader can be compelling. But when the entire Holy Order is just evil, it stops being a complex moral force and becomes nothing more than another villainous faction, no different from a tyrannical empire or a death cult. It ceases to be an order and becomes a cartoonish conspiracy. If the best thing a writer can come up with for a church, knightly order, or religious faction is they're actually awful, then they've utterly failed to explore faith, devotion, and righteousness as meaningful parts of the setting. I think the reason why this trope is so common is that many writers and game masters are afraid of presenting true goodness. They don't believe in righteous institutions. They don't want to write about true faith because it's too simplistic in their mind. They fall back on cynical subversions because it's easier than actually writing about the struggle of being good in an imperfect world. And the reason I know this?
You know him.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
It's difficult. It is not easy to include these types of concepts into your setting without potentially offending somebody. But the truth is, sometimes we must offend somebody. If we never risk offending, we resign ourselves to creating only what is safe, bland, and ultimately forgettable. A compelling setting demands sharp edges, real conflicts, moral weight, and ideas that challenge assumptions. True engagement comes from tension, from forces that matter, and that means people will take issue with the choices that we make. But if our goal is to build something rich and meaningful, we must accept that discomfort is often the price of depth. A world without controversy is a world without conviction. So, the Holy Order that's actually evil trope is bad writing. Not because religious institutions can't have flaws, and not because righteousness is simple, but because it's lazy storytelling that fails to explore faith, morality, and duty in any meaningful way. What do you all think about this, though? How do you approach paladins, their oaths, and the institutions that represent them in your fantasy setting? Let me know in the comments. Either way, thank you for watching. I'm Trill, and I hope you enjoyed.